Publisher of Mike, Jim Roberts, the Managing Director of Mercury Digital, and Madhav Chinnappa, the Head of Strategic Relations, News, and Publishers for Google, who will be moderating. So, welcome to the stage, guys.
Good morning. And actually, that was my first mistake. It's good afternoon, since it's just afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Madhav. I work in Google in news partnerships. And luckily for all of you, we have a very distinguished panel. We have Cory Haik of Mike.com and Jim Roberts of Mercury. Cory, you may have seen before talking as well. She's publisher of Mike, and prior to that was at the Washington Post. Jim is managing director of Mercury, a public strategy and consulting firm, and he used to be both at Mashable and the New York Times, and he's currently the head of Mercury's digital business. Now, Cory and Jim have been incredibly brave. They're going to sit up here in front of a ton of their peers and talk about their fuck-ups. Whoops. Sorry, there you go, another mistake. But I think that's incredibly brave, and I think it's also important. This is not supposed to be an exercise in masochism on their part or sadism on your part, but it's actually quite important to talk about the approach that we take in our industry to failure. I'm not going to bore you with my failures. You've seen at least 2 of them so far. But I do think that when I moved from a news company to a technology company, one of the biggest lessons that I learned was that an attitude to failure and the attitude to failure is actually a very big cultural difference and very important. So let's get on with this. I'm really going to ask Cory and Jim to share some stories. We'll discuss them. We'll talk a bit. But we also want to get questions from the audience as well. We now have 27 minutes and counting to do that. So to get us kicked off, I'm going to flip a coin to see who goes first. I'm going to ask Cory to call it in the air and see how we go.
Heads.
And it is heads.
Great.
So you get to start.
Great. Should I just open up?
Just open up and go for it.
Okay, when I agreed to do this panel, I had heard that it was somewhat cathartic, so I'm pretty excited to release some of these stories. So I had a few, and we talked through a few on the phone, but one that I thought about coming over here, and I don't know if Marty Barron is still in this audience or not, but it was nice to listen to him. It's been a year and a half since I worked at the Post, and they're killing it. But Marty and I went through a lot in our time at the Post. Halfway through my tenure there, Jeff Bezos bought the paper. It was a remarkable experience for me and everything that I was working on, which was really at the time very focused on mobile and new products, growing new audiences, new national audiences. And so we were running and gunning, and it was a time of experimentation, rapid experimentation, and we were trying things. And so negotiating how I would work, because in my job there, I was really charged with figuring out how we do the important journalism that we did in the newsroom and how we translate that to various platforms without dumbing it down, but making it accessible and interesting. And so I would navigate the worlds of product and tech and design and that kind of thinking, and of design thinking, and of sort of product forward with the ways that we traditionally work in the newsroom, which is a much different process and workflow. And we're all chained to our workflows, which is if you've ever worked in product in a legacy media company or just in a news organization, you know that workflow is everything. And getting that right means that either your thing will ultimately fail or succeed within that newsroom, because people have to embrace it. And it starts in the development cycle when you're building products to get buy-in, not only from the newsroom, but from all of the stakeholders in what you're working on. And look, I'm the first to tell you, it doesn't even matter if Jeff Bezos wants you to do it. You still have to get buy-in from everyone who's going to produce it every day. It's fundamental. So I was thinking of a story on the way over here, something that I worked on, and it was one of those really exciting weekend ideas that I had, and I was it was like going to be the future of news, and it was called Topically. And the idea, because I was obsessed with this idea that there are various signals that tell us what is important, and social is one of them. We built a couple of things off of social that help sort of indicate that. But I also thought that, and maybe this is too navel-gazing, but the idea that the things that we publish actually send a signal as well to what's actually important in sort of the news agenda and conversation. And that idea was to figure, we at the time published like close to 750 to 800 stories a day at the Washington Post. It's a lot of stories. And of those stories, you could bucket them, and this is me trying to think about product and tech and what it can do for journalism, and you could bucket those stories into categories pretty easily. And we had some tech that could do that. And so the idea was to then take everything that we publish, our entire corpus of work, and then bucket them by topic. And then reveal those topics in some kind of visual platform or visual design that then would show, very specifically down to like, so not just sports stories, but like what kind of specific sports stories, or within like a local stories, crime, but what specific kinds of crime, across all of the desks. And it was this very beautiful visual product that took in real time the Post journalism and bucketed into topics, and then the user could then navigate. It was built for mobile. The user could navigate by these topics. Sorry, I'm getting into the weeds. I thought this was a brilliant idea, by the way. And it did go live, but I was trying to figure out at what point I should show Marty and other stakeholders what this would look like, because it's kind of hard to explain, and it works on some really complicated / sophisticated technology that's very, very boring to someone who doesn't dabble in that on a daily basis. And I made a few mistakes along the way, which was showing some things way too early and then way too late. And ultimately, we sunset topically. I think it was fun, and the ad side of our business was very excited about it because it had big sponsorship. We didn't have a ton of audience for it. We didn't think that we would. That wasn't the idea. But the idea was to really leverage tech and sort of do some innovative work within product. But I think that showing wireframes very early to a stakeholder group can be very dangerous. So you have to be thoughtful about that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about like how I would have done that differently, because depending on the sort of kind of stakeholder you're talking about, a very senior editor, their skill set or what they're sort of reflexively will go to is they will start to like line edit your piece of paper, and it's like, no, I don't need you to actually, this is not a mock for you to, this is like a directional representation of where this is going. And then showing them way too late when they're like, this cannot work like this. And you know what? You've already built it, and it has to go live at a certain date, and it's too late to untie it. And so I think, in the rearview mirror, would have been much more thoughtful about how.
Thank you. And just picking up on that, I can see that Jim was nodding. When we were talking about this beforehand, we were talking actually a little bit about cultural differences, so understanding what a wireframe is. And I think, I've been at a company that made the mistake of showing a wireframe to a very senior executive, and then you only make that mistake once. Do you think that there's, and Jim, please jump in as well, do you think that's actually cultural and also understanding the roles and responsibilities, and actually sometimes the more senior executives don't get it?
No, go.
Well, I think there is a vocabulary. I think that's. I think we've all gotten more accustomed, and we're using a shared vocabulary, but we're still not quite there. I don't know. Everybody in this room, I would assume, knows what a wireframe is, but maybe you don't. And I think that's probably, the most important thing to get is everyone using the same kinds of words and setting those expectations. But when you're trying to merge a tech and product mindset and process into a very traditional, company, it becomes much harder. And so I think that there really does need to be some kind of shared understanding about how, and like expectation setting about how these processes work. And so culturally, and that's, I think, what actually the death of Topically had to do with. It was like a cultural issue on how these things can be brought to light. I was 100% greenlit for like Skunkworks projects. That's, like my teams, but it's still, you have to sort of get things through the wickets in a way that everyone is behind them.
The reason I was nodding was the concept of asking, of when to ask or when to work things up the system, I think is the trickiest one. My mistakes were always I asked too late, or at least I got critical stakeholders, I think, involved too late in the process. I never really had problems on the wireframe stage because I learned that often even that could have been too late. That getting buy-in from the get-go, because that buy-in almost forced those stakeholders above me to take a little bit of ownership in either the project or the challenge.
I'm also interested because I don't know what your experience has been, but sometimes it can be everybody has a view and nobody can make a decision. It can also be, so if you're trying to figure out when to do it, early or late, that's a very difficult thing to navigate. But this is, you've never heard that before.
Never heard of that before. I will say now, in my role at Mike, I mean, I am the chief executive on all of those decisions, and I'm pretty mindful of the sort of weight of my way in, and I've had to force myself to be more hands-off in the process, because I do want to see things as they develop. But I think best for me to work is very much directionally. We think this is a good idea, and then trust the people that are working on it to execute it, and then really be okay with what comes out on the other side, unless there's some massive legal issue, or we think there would be a real problem. Let it go and let the users tell us if it's, let the users decide. That should be the ratification process. But I'm very conscious of that at this point.
Great. Jim, I'm going to turn to you now in Breakfast News style and ask you to share your story.
Okay, this true confessions moment. I'm going to actually tell two stories. One's very quick. The other one is longer, hopefully not too long. Was this a mistake or not? I'm not 100% certain how I would classify it, but I was on the wrong side of history once, and I will always remember it, and I can talk about it now and smile. I was one of the people who fought vehemently against the New York Times paywall when it was instituted, 2010, I can't even remember precisely the date, around 2010. I thought, oh my gosh, it's going to undo everything that we'd been trying to do on our digital platforms in terms of building audience, reach, new corners of the globe, new demographics, younger people. And what are they up to now? 2 million paid digital subscribers, something of that sort. But I don't know that I was necessarily wrong per se, but it was an interesting exercise. There were not that many votes against the paywall back then. Mine was one of them. Okay, we're done with that. The thing that I have given a lot of thought to is something that happened to me personally in April of 2016. I was working as the Chief Content Officer of Mashable, and I lost my job. This is not something that I've talked about very publicly. I haven't talked about it to many people. But I thought, okay, what was the mistake? What did I do wrong? I just said, actually used a euphemism. I lost my job. I was terminated. I was fired, laid off, whatever way you want to describe it. The company eliminated 30 jobs in total on a single day back in April of last year. A very traumatic experience for me and my colleagues who also lost their jobs, many of whom I had actually recruited. Since that time, I have reflected, where did I go wrong? Why? It caught me completely blindsided as well. So, what was the miscalculation there? I'm not 100% certain I know the answer, but I do have a couple of ideas. And I think it's a useful thing to think about. I was in a role, we talk about the autonomy that Cory has at Mike. I had a very autonomous role in running the editorial department. I was in charge of content. That was it. And I was also in charge of building a staff, recruiting a staff, sort of arguing in favor of that staff and protecting that staff. and I do feel that in a certain amount of hindsight that did I take that too far? Did I get closer to the people who reported to me than to the COO, the CFO, the head of sales, the head of marketing, the CEO? Managing my job within that specific matrix, I don't think I did the greatest job of doing. I think that had I understood their issues better, had I worked to gain the trust of, again, my boss and the people who had responsibilities on in other portions of the organization, if I had given that more attention or as much attention as I had given to winning the trust and the support of my own team, maybe I wouldn't have been as blindsided. Maybe I could have somehow managed the painful transition when the company had to downsize in that way.
So just to clarify, in that downsizing move where 30 people lost the job, you weren't part of that process to make the decision?
No, not at all. I was as blindsided as they were by that move. So I asked myself, should I have been more aware?
It's interesting because it reminds me of a previous failure session that we did with Mark Little. And Mark was talking about what is that balance as a founder about how you protect your people and how you manage the realities of the business. And, being all rah, everything's going fine when you don't have enough money, is that the right thing to do? It sounds like there's a similar balance between...
I certainly know that I was trying to achieve that. I mean, one of the things that I did going into that job when I took it nearly 3 years earlier was I was told, we want you to build a respectable news organization. And as part of the recruiting process, I would go to journalists who I knew, respected, I thought would be wonderful additions to the staff. And one of the things I was able to say is, hey, you are about to, be on a rocket ship. We're launching. We're going somewhere. And I felt the need going forward to continually prove that to them. Even when, and our first year and a half, the rocket ship was moving up.
So you were talking to the astronauts on the rocket ship, but you should have been talking to mission control a little more?
Maybe a little bit more, right? Exactly.
Houston, we may have a problem.
We may have a problem. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Shall we go to another story from Cory? Do you want to?
Sure, but to Jim's, Jim and I are friends, and I have the war stories, and I know about the massacre and all of that occurred. And we've hired a bunch of those people from Mashable, and they're wonderful. They're great journalists. But I do think that as journalists, if you start as a journalist and you move into management positions, or you move into more tech and product roles or startups, what you don't always have your footing on how to sort of move through those orgs the right way, and learning to manage up and down and sideways and backwards and stakeholder and all of that. I mean, it sounds awful, but it's really important.
Sorry to just jump in, but in a previous company, and I was a news company, someone pointed to me, said, in this company, people are promoted because they're good journalists, and then they become managers, and actually sometimes all the things that make you a good journalist make you a terrible manager. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. I mean, you're cynical by nature. You question everything. You don't like to toe the company line. That's your job as a journalist. As a manager, it's a bit different. And so I think that really being honest with ourselves about, are you or should you be a reporter? Or should you run a newsroom? Or should you be a chief content officer or something? I mean, it's a very different kind of thing. And so, and one to think about. And I mean, I reflect on that as well in my own career.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the bright, shiny thing, opportunity cost thing we discussed?
Oh yeah, more failure? Totally.
Let's keep going. We got 10 minutes. And
okay,
we'll try and keep time for questions. So we'll try and keep 5 minutes for questions or so. If there are questions, start thinking about them now, please.
I'll power through this one. The sort of double-edged sword and the love-hate relationship that I have with, we all probably have with like new shiny things, which are like new platforms, new products that are launching, working with our platform partners and getting very excited about stuff, which is great, and being able to them. And Mike is built for that, and I'm absolutely in love with the way that we do that. But it can also be exhausting. And so about this time last year at Facebook's F8 conference, and respectively, I say this if there are any Facebook people in the audience, live and bots were the biggest thing, and they were going to be the most important thing. And like Zuckerberg famously had like stopped work on everything and put everybody to work on live, and then bots was this thing, or Messenger, this other very important thing. And at Mike, we got very excited very early, and we had actually something built for F8. We built 2 bots. And we put a lot of energy into it, and I don't just mean on the product side. I also mean on the editorial side, which is where I think that sweet spot, and you can really build something awesome, is when you connect in that newsroom piece and that product piece. And so we built something that required a daily production. It wasn't just like somebody's side job. We actually dedicated a full person in the newsroom to help produce this every day, and then like a sprinkling of folks around that would all kind of work on it. So in total, like 5-ish people had real investment in this bot. And then what you saw is that, it was great. Everyone was excited. CNN launched. There was a bunch of retail partners. It was the future. And then there was really no way to promote it. There was no way to get an audience for it. And tree falls in a forest. And look, it was cool. I was really excited about what we did. We're still, thinking about bots. But that Messenger bot no longer really lives. We have sunset it. But it took a while to do that. And this was a case where we should have pulled the plug much earlier. And the teams that were producing this just kind of really felt demoralized because they were so excited about it. And it was this real amazing moment of tech and edit working together, and they were spinning their wheels, and folks were just like, well, we've got all this other work to do. Why do these guys just sit around and get to do that? And there were like 5 people that engage with it. So for me, looking back, we should have pulled the plug much earlier, because I think that it can be exhausting to your teams to constantly continue to put them on different projects, but I think it's more exhausting and can be sort of disheartening when you have people working on things that just don't have a lot of sort of support internally. And that's, I think, fundamentally what I want to avoid, is to really, it's not a full pivot, because if you say like that word in a startup, it's a very scary one, but it's more like, make sure you shut things down quickly and move on to the next thing. I think that's called fail fast.
But just to pick up on that, do you think actually the tech culture of it's a bright, shiny thing, launch and sometimes forget, do you think that hurts? Or it actually exacerbates this problem, which is that what should you do? Do them all, and you have to do them all, but you can't do them all.
Yeah, like 1,000%. That's part of the problem. I mean, like the fetishization of the new is an issue. It's a real issue. I mean, Marty Baron's analogy of like putting wheels on luggage is like not the sexiest of analogies I've ever heard, but like guys got a point.
It's a brilliant one.
It's like not everything has to be a moonshot. It's like fix what you have. I mean, they're really good at journalism and they're killing it right now, and they're like fighting other reporters in the streets. I'd rather be doing that than fight for the like new shiny thing we should all be working on that's going to have no audience.
I think that was the point we were discussing when we discussed this beforehand. One of the other problems with the bright shiny thing is the opportunity cost, right? If you're constantly moving from that, how do you do that? And I have to say, working for a tech company, I think the tech companies have a bright, shiny thing. And that's because of their culture of product-based approach. So every product team that's working on bright, shiny thing 1, 2, and 3 thinks theirs is the best, and they'll come to the news organization and do that. And I think tech companies need to get a bit better about triaging that in a more sustainable way. Sorry, rant over. This is supposed to be about you guys. We are coming to the 5-minute mark, so unless you want to, do you want to?
I can do this in 33 seconds. My bright shiny thing was live video at the New York Times in 2011, and it was incredibly complicated, incredibly expensive. I can't even imagine how much money we spent, but it was a lot. I think what were we, maybe 3 years before our time? If only Meerkat or Periscope or Facebook Live had been available then, it might have been a lot different, but that was my shiny thing.
So it's all about timing, is what you're saying?
A lot of it's about timing. Yeah, I learned plenty from the experience, but man, I thought this is going to change everything.
Yeah, in the .com bubble, when the dot-com bubble burst, somebody said to me, it's not first mover advantage, it's first arriver.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the floor? It's a bit difficult to see, so please put your hand up if you do. If you don't, I'm just going to continue chatting because this is bloody interesting to me if it's not for you guys. I hope it is interesting for you guys. Any questions? I can't see anything, but if you do, please stand up and shout. So Jim, if I may, can we go back to the New York Times and paywall?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Because you said something that sounded almost contradictory. You were on the wrong side of history, but you weren't wrong. Can you just elaborate on that? Because I actually agree with you, but I think...
Sure. Well, I was on the wrong side of history because history will show that the decision to do what they did and the way they did it has proven, I think, successful beyond even the expectations of the most optimistic person 6 and 7, 8 years ago when it was being discussed. I don't think I never heard the number of 2 million paid subscribers. Never. And to have reached that threshold, I think is extraordinary. Now, I came at it from a point of view back then of having worked very hard on the digital side to build an audience, and to build an audience that I thought was possibly a little different than the core New York Times audience. Certainly geographically, I know we were reaching people around the world who couldn't get a physical newspaper. I felt like we were also reaching young people who maybe hadn't quite been exposed to New York Times journalism. I worried a great deal that imposing a paywall in any fashion would have cut off that growth and block that audience, those audiences.
And do you think that the reason that you're on the wrong side of history is actually the execution as opposed to the principle? And maybe you were right. If they put up a hard paywall from day zero,
without a doubt,
the
way that paywall was built, they left all kinds of side doors in it, so you could access at least a certain amount of content through social channels, and so it was open in that sense. Obviously, if you wanted to engage more deeply into the content, you had to pay.
Yeah, I don't know if people remember, but when it was launched, people were like, "Where is the paywall?" If you remember,
right,
because
that's
it was
true.
so
because there were so many ways to get into it, and I think that did make a difference. But the other aspect from my standpoint is I did feel that there was a certain principle at stake, and at least there needed to be a voice in the room that said, "Now wait a minute, let's think about what we will lose or what we have the potential to lose if we go in this direction."
That comes to the groupthink aspect of it. Cory, do you worry about groupthink, that, especially if you're grabbing onto things? How do you work with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think going back to the sort of fetishization of the new, I think it can be dangerous, particularly in venture-backed land, where it's sort of VCs have one particular idea about the future. And if you think about like Cheddar, for example, which you guys probably all know Cheddar. It's like wildly successful in its own way. It's sort of reinventing on a budget. Still costs millions of dollars to produce, but on a budget via Facebook Live, like basically finance, personal finance, and news around money for a different demo. And I think that you can see a bunch of sort of startups are like, we should do what Cheddar's doing. Because look, they're making live video on the cheap, and now they've got these TV deals and further investment, and it's so smart, and we should all do it. But there's a real danger in that, because I don't know that all content translates the same way. And people can get really spun up to just sort of try things because someone else is doing it, and it's not the same at all. I don't know that you can sort of produce on-the-fly news live, and sort of reinventing. You've seen sort of what Vice has tried to do with reinventing like the nightly newscast in HBO, and it's fantastic, but it's not exactly like brand new. It's hard to reinvent that format, and to just put a microphone in someone's hand and go live because someone else is doing it is a bad idea. Sorry, that's a very specific example, but I think it's a groupthink kind of thing that we're all victim to, and we have to be very mindful of like what our own IP is and what we're trying to do, and not get distracted by what other people are actually doing, and then maybe seeing some success with.
Okay, well, we seem to be out of time, but I'm going to have to do the stereotypical end of panel thing, right? With the stories, with that, is there one lesson that you would say that you take out of any of the stories that you have in a quick, pithy fashion that they always ask you to do?
Yeah, I don't know if it's pithy, but I probably already said it, but I'm very mindful of, my seat at the table and how I give feedback and when I show people things and sort of where we are in the process and how we greenlight, and then in what we actually don't greenlight, just from my own experiences, that it really matters and these shouldn't be flip decisions.
Try to build some consensus. I feel like you work in a matrix environment, you work with other people, being the determined bull to get things done isn't always going to succeed. Consensus is important, and I've learned that the hard way a few times.
Great, well, thank you very much. Please will you thank Cory and Jim?
Thank you.
Thank you.